A word as we begin this morning. If you've been waiting to see if, like Rabbi Reuben did so beautifully on Rosh Hashanah morning, I will be speaking about Israel, this sermon, my friends, is what I have to say about Israel. If you've been wondering whether I'd be addressing the state of American democracy, this sermon is what I have to say about that too. And if you've been wondering if I have any advice about how to deal with a friend or a child or a parent who leaves you at a loss for words because their political perspectives make your blood boil, I hope you'll find counsel in my words this morning as well. I want to try an experiment. Don't worry, it won't hurt and it won't last more than a moment. I do want to ask you to join me in the experiment, though, because there's a chance that we'll each be changed for the better if we do this together. So if you trust me, I invite you for just a moment to close your eyes and imagine an apple. Can you see it? Can you see its color, its texture? Can you see where it's located in space? Could you describe it to another person? Okay, you can open your eyes. The experiment is over. This summer, I realized that I experience the world differently than about 96% of the rest of humanity. Because when I close my eyes and try and imagine an apple, I see nothing. I understand the idea of an apple. I know what an apple looks like and what it is, but I can't see it in what you might call my mind's eye. For the record, when I close my eyes, I also can't see my wife's face. I can't see Masada, even though I've been there dozens of times. I can't see a panda bear. I can't see the Big Dipper. I can remember holding an apple, but I can't see it when I close my eyes. Yeah, Kobe can't see it either. Just for a brief moment, raise your hand if, like me, when I asked you to close your eyes and imagine an apple, you couldn't see anything. All right. It turns out that I and a few other people here in the sanctuary experience a brain phenomenon called aphantasia, which literally means not seeing. It's a phenomenon that scientists tell us is experienced by between 1% and 4% of human beings. When I first learned about it this summer from a podcast of all places, I worried that there was something wrong with me. Do I need to go see the doctor? I honestly had never imagined that anyone else did see an apple, or anything else for that matter, when they closed their eyes. There are other similar phenomena, like the percentage of people who experience synesthesia, people who experience one sense through another, like hearing colors or tasting shapes. Yeah, that's a thing. And there are folks who experience prosopagnosia. They have a complete inability to recognize faces, even of people they know very well. Please note what I've also learned. These phenomena are normal variations of the human experience. They are not conditions that require treatment. I'd like to think, many other gifts. I have many other ways of perceiving the world. Maybe some of them are even heightened by the fact that I also experience synesthesia, aphantasia, but I have no way of knowing. But here's the bottom line. We human beings literally see the world differently from one another, sometimes based on how our brains work, sometimes based on our life's experience. As I spoke about on Erev Rosh Hashanah, we each have a unique story that informs how we see what we see, and no doubt that informs our perceptions of the larger world in important ways. When you think about that, it's pretty amazing and remarkable. As author John Green has said, as human beings, we are stuck for the whole time we're here inside of one consciousness and one way of looking at the world. And it turns out that my consciousness is different than yours, and yours is different than the person who's sitting next to you or behind you. That is both cool and interesting and strange and important for us to understand, Green says. We will never really know what it's like to be someone else. In the last 6 months, I've had more than 100 individual meetings with members of the congregation. I wanted to hear your stories. I wanted to hear how you're feeling in this moment and how you see this convoluted time in which we live. And honestly, I've never been more moved in my rabbinate than I have been by these conversations. You open your hearts to me and your sacred stories, and I feel so privileged to have listened, to have been shaken and stirred by the nuance and complexity of the perspectives of our teens, our college students, our 20 and 30-somethings, the parents of our nursery school students and religious school students, our empty nesters and seniors in our community. The life stories and journeys and experiences of all these members of our community are each unique. And those unique stories inform how our fellow congregants view the world. This morning, I want to share with you just a small fraction of the stories I've heard from members who are sitting in this sanctuary and participating on live stream just about the war that was thrust upon Israel last October 7th. And while I won't share their names, I have asked and have been given permission to share their stories. I imagine that some of the stories will not surprise you. Others may be harder for you to hear. Please stay with me, though, as I hold up a kind of mirror to share with you some of how this beautiful, holy, variegated congregation sees the world at this moment. Among the people I've had coffee with have been a number of college students and academics who have felt terrified and alone because the pro-Palestinian protests on their campuses make no space for Israeli rights or Jewish rights, or in many cases, for space for Jews at all. I met with a group of college students who grew up in this congregation who came to tell me about a protest they had helped organize against Israel's policies. I took a walk with a congregant in his 70s who was recently wrestling out loud here at the synagogue with the death of innocent Palestinians in this war when he found himself being called a disloyal, self-hating Jew by another congregant. I had coffee with a congregant in his 40s who has close family in Israel and who is worried about whether Israel will be able to survive this war. I sat with a congregant in her 50s who told me that based on the way Israel has conducted this war, she has given up hope that Israel will ever be an important part of her otherwise strong Jewish identity. I spent time with more than a few congregants who have been made to feel by friends and coworkers as if their support for the hostages is equivalent to them ignoring the rights of Palestinians. I heard from more than a few congregants who feel abandoned by people they thought were their friends, who haven't once reached out to check in about how they're feeling following Hamas's brutal attacks, who now find themselves questioning for the first time why we as a congregation would ever waste time trying to build interreligious cooperation. And I also spent time with more than a few congregants who reminded me that when Jews are alone in the world, it never turns out well for us, so that interfaith relationships are still worth fighting for. And these are just a few of the stories I heard just about the war in the Middle East. I also heard diverse stories about what you believe about God, about why you feel the way you do about the city of New York, about your experiences of anti-Semitism, about the state of our national politics, about how you feel about unhoused people and immigrants, about the upcoming election, and so much more. In some of the conversations, congregants and I found ourselves largely in agreement on many topics. In others, we profoundly disagreed. In the latter cases, we rarely changed each other's minds about the subject at hand. But I know for my part, in many cases, my heart was opened because I came to understand why congregants felt the way they felt. I came to understand the lenses through which they see the world. And I believe that in most cases, they came to understand my lenses too. Although I profoundly disagreed with certain things I heard, I thought a lot about how we might stay together as a community without tearing ourselves apart. I was often reminded in some of the more difficult conversations of the teaching of 17th century Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who taught, it's not hard work to distance yourself from another person. The real work is to draw them close. As I shared my general experiences in these meetings with Rabbi Rubin, she pointed me to a TED Talk given by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Nigerian author of the 2013 award-winning book Americana. In her talk entitled The Danger of a Single Story, Adichie asks, what stories do we write in our heads about other people based on just a tiny bit of information? We see or hear that someone is poor. We see the color of their skin or have a perception of their gender. We hear where they were raised or their religious background, and we immediately, subconsciously, write an entire script about them in our heads. We can feel sorry for someone even before we meet them. We can feel a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity for someone about whom we know almost nothing. We can feel arising a kind of primal disgust or fear or hate of someone based on one tiny detail about their lives, either something we can see about them or something they reveal. My friends, we write stories about the people who watch that news channel, or the people who voted for that person, or the people who went to that rally. And when we write a story like that, we almost always write it in such a way that it casts the other person outside our tribe completely. We feel nothing but instant pity or fear or distrust or even hate for them. And such stories we write leave no room for us to be open to the possibility that that person might just be another person trying to navigate their way through a complicated world, just like we are. As I shared parts of my story with many of the people I met with in recent months, I had a wonderful childhood with parents who loved me. I had joyous Jewish experiences as I grew up and role models who inspired me to become a rabbi. I met an incredible life partner who's been a blessing in my life for 32 years of marriage, and I have two amazing kids who keep me on my toes and who challenge me to be the best version of myself. And I also have experienced traumas and loss in my life that inform how I see the world in which we live. One of my best friends in high school died of a heart attack when we were both 18 years old. My first time living in Israel was in the lead up to the first Gulf War, and I was given a gas mask and taught how to create a sealed room in my dorm in Jerusalem. My grandparents were Holocaust refugees who lost almost all of their family members to the death camps. My father, as most of you know, was murdered 25 years ago. All of these stories, the joyful ones, the painful ones, and a million others, make me who I am. Each and every one of these stories is part of my own personal book of life. And if someone else were to insist one aspect of my story was the only lens through which they saw me, well, I'd like to think that they were missing the forest and the trees. They would be flattening my experience and overlooking the many stories that formed me. As Adichie says, when all we know about another human being is a single story, we rob them of their dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It leads us to stereotype them, to pigeonhole them, to discount them and anything they might have to teach us. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. And as Jews, we know all too well, don't we, how a single story creates stereotypes. As Adichie continues, the problem with stereotypes are not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story, show a person or a people as one thing, only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. But meeting with so many of you has led me to resolve that I'm going to interrogate the single stories I've written about other people that I thought I knew in their fullness. I've learned so much, not only about what you believe and about you and what you think, but about the messy and contradictory and joyful stories of your life that inform how you see the world. You each have gratitude for the blessings in your life. You each have painful experiences and losses you've endured. Each of your memories are different. Each of your family histories are different. Each of you literally sees the world with different eyes. There is something about being human, though, that seems to incline us towards seeing difference as pathology. We seem to feel almost instinctively as if people who are different from us need to be fixed or treated or repaired in order to make them worthy of being in our orbit. As Ken Burns recently put it, we have a preoccupation with always making the other wrong. But there is another conscious choice we could make when we confront difference or difference of opinion. When we're inclined to distrust or dislike or even hate another person or what they have to say, we could ask ourselves, how many stories do I know about this person? And if the answer to that question is less than 3, we could consider learning 1 or 2 more stories from them directly before writing them completely out of our lives. If we were to stay in the conversation for 1 more minute, if we were to elicit from them one more story, perhaps we would learn that they are indeed a dangerous, terrible, scary person that we should stay away from. That might happen. But my experience tells me that more often than not, there are other stories that inform how they see the world, the experiences that form them, even curiosity that they bring around our story, if we give them a minute, that might just soften our hearts to their humanity. If you made yourself vulnerable enough, you might come to understand and even appreciate that they are, on the most essential levels, wrestling with the same fears and the same longings as you are. You might come to understand that what they hope for in life below the surface of the single thing you knew about them before is the same thing that you hope for. Look, I know it's impossible for me to know every story in the life of another person. I've been married to Alyssa for 32 amazing years, and while I know what it's like to love her, and I know what it's like to be loved by her, I will never know what it's like to actually be her. But what I've learned from each of these 100 conversations is that it is impossible to understand another person, even, or perhaps especially a person I disagree with, without listening to at least 3 stories from their life. Let me share with you just one more example from my conversations. There's a congregant I've gotten to know well over these last 9 years. We've been together for joyous occasions and sad ones too. We disagree with each other about almost everything politically, especially around the Israel conversation. And I am so grateful that he is in my life. And I'm pretty sure he's grateful that I'm in his too. And we have a routine now. When he hears me preach about something he disagrees with, he calls me and he says, "I guess it's time to have coffee again." And we do. And breaking news, we don't generally change each other's minds. But by sharing our stories with one another, we've come to understand each other's humanity. We've come to understand that in this case, we each care about Israel, that we're each living with the joyous, historic, messy mosaic of this land that we both love so much, and that we both want it to be safe and secure and righteous. For 2 people who could have easily given up on one another, easily written each other off, he definitely could have gone and found another synagogue. We've decided again and again to stay in it with each other and to listen at least as much as we talk. We've each made a conscious choice to stay in relationship because we've come to understand through lots of hard conversations, let me be clear, that we need each other, that the Jewish people need both of us, that Israel does. Each of the conversations I've had with congregants have taught me this lesson again and again, and I really like coffee. So I'm going to spend as much time as you'll allow me to continue to listen to and learn your stories. And I hope and pray that perhaps you'll continue to reciprocate, to bring your curiosity, patience, and interest in my story, perhaps especially when you disagree with me. So on your way out of the sanctuary today, the staff will be handing out cards that you can redeem for a cup of coffee or tea or hot chocolate, or maybe we'll need bourbon sometime in the coming months. What you're helping me to understand, and I humbly hope I can help you understand in these difficult times, is that we need to truly come to know one another. Not only because we're each created in the image of the divine, although that should be enough, but also because our struggles and our stories and our destinies are inextricably linked, even if we wish sometimes they were not. My friends, our people is too small for us to excommunicate those we disagree with. Each and every one of our proud Jewish stories, our voices, our values, our struggles, our joys, the things we can all agree on and the things we differ on profoundly, we need them all to continue to be a part of the larger Jewish story. Because if they're not, if we tear others out of the Jewish people every time we disagree, someone else will write a single story about us, and I promise that we will not like that experience either. The story someone else will write about us starts like this: all Jews are like this, or all Jews are like that. And haven't we heard that story before? How did it turn out the last time? How about the last 100 times? As we sit in this liminal space before the gates close, 25 days before the election, still in the middle of the unfolding war in the Middle East, with tensions rising on campus once again, we are divided as a people and as a nation in deeply profound ways. We don't all agree with each other. We don't all agree with our rabbis. We don't all agree with what I've said in this sermon, I can promise you. And yet, we are Jews who have decided to stay in it together because we are Jews who know deep in our hearts, deep in our messy amalgam of stories, that we need one another. What if the solution to what Robert Putnam and other political scientists warn us is a fast-moving descent into an era of, quote, inequality, political polarization, social dislocation, and cultural narcissism started with us being willing to stay in it for one more story when the conversations we have with others get hard? Now, there's so much we might like to fix in society at large in this regard, but why don't we start by practicing this right here with the people in this room? We here on the corner of 79th and 2nd, we already have a shared sacred story, a shared commitment to Jewish life, and we are already in relationship with one another, at least to some extent. We are sharing this space of our own free will, knowing, as we must know, that the people sitting next to us, behind us, and in front of us see the world with eyes, with perceptions, with a diversity of stories and perspectives that are different from our own, and that we'll never comprehend if we don't ask. We have in this community of meaning, connection, and purpose a laboratory where we could experiment, where we could speak to each other differently than the harsh and crass ways we sometimes might outside of these walls. A laboratory where we could choose to learn from one another at a time when so much of our world seeks to separate us into our own ideological tribes. To be clear, I am not advocating that you surrender to the views of your ideological opponents. I'm not advocating that you put yourself in danger by engaging with someone who seeks to physically harm you. Nor do I believe, honestly, that sitting together is some kind of kumbaya panacea. But I am advocating for staying in it with one another and not walking away even when we disagree, even when we hear things that might make us feel uncomfortable. I will make the case that if we listen to a perspective that we don't agree with for one more minute, that discomfort we might feel won't actually break us in half. It won't destroy our souls. It won't ruin the rest of our lives. But it might just open our hearts. It might just counterintuitively deepen our relationship with the other person. It might just change us in ways that the world needs so badly. My friends, the society that we are living in is tearing itself apart. And the society we need requires making space for the many stories that make up each beautiful, nuanced, contradictory one of us. As Rabbi Sharon Brous writes, we need to learn to see those with whom we disagree not as enemies, but as fellow human beings, flawed and striving, not as a path to capitulation, but instead toward the sacred recognition of each other's humanity. Over many eras of human existence, stories have been used to dispossess and to malign. We know that well. To break the dignity of individuals and peoples. We've been reminded of that as Jews all too often in the last year. But stories can also humanize, can also repair broken dignity, can also connect us to one another in ways we didn't imagine were possible. The Torah portion we're about to hear from the book of Deuteronomy begins this way. Each and every one of you are called this day before Adonai your God, your tribal heads, your elders, your officials, your children, your wives, the stranger in your midst, from the woodchopper to the water drawer, to enter into the covenant of Adonai your God. And the rabbis ask, why did the Torah have to list all of those individual groups of people within the community? And in good rabbinic tradition, they answer their own question. They say, each person Each person among the Israelites experienced the revelation at Sinai in their own unique way. And still, they each needed to be seen as a part of the covenant. They each had a role to play, and the Israelites needed to be able to rely on each and every one of them. So let us, in this new year, choose to reject the single story, to realize that there is never just a single story about any person, and never only one way to see the world. Let us be curious and countercultural in leaning in to the complex and powerful narratives that make each of us who we are, that make each of us see the world as we do, not to change one another's minds necessarily or to fix what's broken in another person, but to open our hearts and to open the other's heart and to appreciate one another's gifts. Rabbi Nachman was right. It's not hard work to distance yourself from another person. The real work is to draw them close. So may this be a year in which we draw near even to those with whom we disagree, because there is a sacred human story, a sacred Jewish story that is larger, more beautiful, and so much richer when we weave into it the sacred stories of each and every one of us. Gemara Chatima Tova.